I had sort of an interesting reflection on Tolkien as I was thinking about this call earlier
Hmm.
this week, and just the nature of story. And he has always seemed to me unique. I mean, in a number of ways, but when you talk about world building in particular, and some of the series out there that are known for it, obviously Tolkien's a big one, but you've got the Wheel of Time,
Yeah.
or the King Killer Chronicles, or Brandon Sanderson's work, or any of this. Like,
Hmm.
they're all very intricate and well crafted worlds,
Yeah.
but none of them feel to me the way that Middle Earth does.
True. Yeah.
Um, and I was thinking about that, and I think part of it is that Tolkien not only gives you this incredible story, but there's this whole nother like meta level where the characters in the story are experiencing the nature of story, and it's woven
Mm.
into the story that we're getting, right? So like,
Okay.
one of my favorite lines, all the way on the frivolous end of things, right? When the hobbits in Lord of the Rings, they first get to Crick Hollow, right? Like, they're not even out of the Shire yet. They get to take a bath, and I forget if it's Merry or Pippin, but somebody starts singing one of Bilbo's favorite bath songs, which is hilarious in and of itself, but it also implies that Bilbo has many bath songs
And
from
that they're
which one can
around to
select
know
a
what they
favorite.
are. Yeah.
Right, right. And so you have this sense where in this case song, is like a part of their lives. But then, they get to Rivendell, and you have this whole, pages long poem that Bilbo wrote about Erendil. And so it's not just that the Silmarillion exists, right? It's not just
Hmm.
that the world is complex,
Hmm.
but you actually see the complexity of the world, its themes and its meaning impacting the characters themselves in a way that I don't think I've seen anyone else do.
That is interesting. Yeah. I've not read the couple of ones that you'd mentioned, King Killer. I've read a bunch of a few, not enough of Brandon Sanderson, and but just thinking about Sanderson and what he writes, I from what I can remember, haven't yet discerned that sense of he's sort of inducting us into um how do you say, like, he's got a massive his Cosmere has a plan, and
Mhm.
each story is giving you pieces of this bigger story that's going on. But you're right in that that's not what Tolkien's doing. Tolkien's introducing us to a specific kind of reality. Um, and through the lens of these hobbits, right? He's inducting them, so us by proxy, inducting them into this greater relationship with true reality that they've been blinkered from or blinded from. And so it's not just more expansive in the sense that there's more, but it's there's a depth, there's a spiritual deepening that is happening to these characters that isn't happening in, let's say, Sanderson. Um, is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I think of like Aragorn, obviously, as the heir of Isildur and all this is a great example. But like, you get the sense, or I get the sense reading Aragorn, that his lineage
Hmm.
matters to him, right? Like, the stories that he comes from matter, even all the way back to the first age. The fact that he's raised by the elves and he knows the stories of Beren and Luthien, and
Hmm.
Hurin, and
Yeah.
all of these things. Like, you see the influence of the story on the person of Aragorn.
Hmm.
Whereas so many books, again, maybe that level of detail is there. It's this person was this person's son, was this person's son, was this person's son,
Hmm.
and they tell you stories about those people that, like you said, that level of spiritual depth of meaning.
Mm.
What does it mean to this character that I'm reading about,
Yeah.
that his great 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 grandfather conquered this land?
Mm. Hmm.
There's very few books I've read, I think, that are able to not only talk about the events in time and space and relate the events in time and space,
Hmm.
but relate them on that level of meaning and purpose, and the telos within the universe.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever read Stephen Lawhead?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. I'm struggling to remember the name of the novel. So I read the Dragon King saga. It's a trilogy
Hmm.
growing up, and I loved it. Like I believe he's Christian. I think he's British. He has, I think he also grew up on Tolkien, diet of all of those, and then he has a very specific, distinct love for, gosh, I think it's Anglo-Saxon or British, old British culture, kind of like what Tolkien did.
Hmm.
And so he went and he wrote the a Merlin series. What's the name? Daily Wire is actually taking some of his novels and turning it into a high production fantasy
Oh, cool.
series. Yeah. So that's I've been kind of keeping my eye on that. That seems like it's going to be fun. And so that tracks how Atlantis sank and sort of fell, and then that ancient order of whatever Atlantis was migrated or set up shop in ancient Britain and became the order of druids and so on that gave rise to Merlin and Taliesin and ultimately Camelot. So he's tying Camelot, this concept of what Camelot is, to the ancient reality of what Atlantis was, and it's the continuation of that, or something like this, or the best of it. Anyhow, he wrote another novel, and I'm trying to remember the name, but this goes back to what you're saying about Tolkien, where there's a modern day character who is sucked back in time to the ancient time of the Anglo-Saxon or the I'm now drawing a blank. Who precedes the Anglo-Saxons? Well, it's before the Normans. Maybe it is Anglo-Saxon. Those British peoples, and he is a completely modern. Well, okay, modern as in 1930s,
Hmm.
taken into that world, and he has to learn the way that it was to be human back in the old days, which is this
Mm.
thing that Tolkien intuited that no modern authors have really captured in the way that I've seen, or the books that I've read. And so, what this book is, and I wish I could remember the name. I'll have to look it up, maybe drop it in the comments. But the what Lawhead does, he's so in love with this ancient view of brotherhood and family and tribal memory and story and lineage and archetype and relation to the gods and all of this stuff, all of these sort of layers within which we exist as men, as people. And he re-immerses that character into that world. And of course, it's one of these time travel sort of stories. He ends up returning back to the modern day. I'm not really giving anything away there. And there's that sort of disjoint, that shock of return
Right.
to the modern day and how the world is so thin and flattened, and we are so denuded from all of these layers of meaning that used to be normalized. And I see Tolkien is deeply in love with this sort of Viking ancient world of all these layers of belonging, all these layers of living out, that we don't have anymore. Um, so there's a thought. What goes through your mind with that?
Yeah, yeah. It makes me think of. Gosh, I wish I was sitting by my other bookshelf. I could just grab it. But at the end of um, the Two Towers, right? Frodo and Sam are talking, and Sam is basically talking about the stories, and you got all these great figures in the past, and they did these great things, and we're gonna have our story too, and what are they gonna say about us? And he points out that the Vale of Galadriel, right, with the light of the Star of Erendil, he's like, Sam makes that connection that like, hey, these ancient stories, look, we've got a piece of it right here. We're part of the same story,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's where again you see that rupture, and just like you said, the modern conception of what it even means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
I think we put so much on ourselves, right, in a very
Mm-hmm.
individualistic society.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna write my own stars or what have you. um, I think it's so easy to forget that there is so much more to be written than we could ever do ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't have to diminish me
Mm-hmm.
to be part of a story that's greater than me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think people feel that threat sometimes of well, if I do this your way, or if the world operates according to principles that I didn't come up with, right? Like my freedom is curtailed, or
Mhm.
something to that effect. But again, I think looking at sort of Tolkien and just the manner of the existence of his characters, you see a little bit of that richness that is there when you can be your own story, but also recognize your place in the greater one.
Mhm. A more modern story that hits on this and does some interesting things, I think, is Moana.
Hmm.
Because as a character, she's trying to navigate her existence within the tribe. And then there's a point at which she sort of has to pull away from that, the same way that a child pulls away from its family or their family to have a sense of actual freedom and self discovery so that they are freely able to re engage with everything else in a more mature relationship as opposed to a default, unintentional relationship. And so her re engagement with Tefiti, I can't remember the goddess character at the end, um, but she takes
Tafiti.
ownership. Sorry?
Tafiti.
Yeah, she takes ownership of that relationship. That there's a part that she is supposed to play with that, and then mediating that back to the rest of the world, and then the role that she then plays in her community, and so on. This makes me think of what was that line? Oh, there was I used to wonder or ask, like, what happened to the world, right? Such that, like, after the Christian or the emergence of the Christian era, um, why is it we don't live in the same world as the Iliad? Like, where did the gods go? Right? Why is it that the trees and all of the fields and everything is now silent? Why do we not have the same? Why is everything not throbbing with the kind of life that all of the ancient myths and stories used to see? Because I'm not prepared to accept that they were all completely deluded and tripping on mushrooms.
Right.
Instead, what I've now come to get a sense of is that at this stage in our human development, it's that same principle now going on. We used to, one of the Inklings, what was his name? He wrote the book Saving the Appearances. Barfield. So Owen Barfield, who just recently passed like 20 years ago or something, was one of these fascinating formative influences, I think, on the other two. And the more I've been trying to read Barfield's work, the stronger sense I get that the other two were creating these stories to engage with his ideas, which were so bold and at the same time so not radical in the sense of returning to ancient roots of what it means to be a human being, right? They just crawled out of these horrific foxholes from the war, and they're all compelled by these same questions. And Barfield's like, something really awful has happened, and why are we in this state as humans? How are we able to live this way? And so he advanced this thesis, this proposition of original participation, the sense that we actually used to be porous to all of the angelic activity that goes on around us. We used to be a lot more porous to it, and we see that in all the stories. But then a
Right.
point happened where it changed. And so the line of thinking there is, we as individual consciousnesses and so on needed to separate from that in the same way a child separates from the embrace of its parents, from that sort of not amorphous, but that kind of ill-defined identity where the child and the parent is like, I don't know, consanguineous, whatever. There's a smart word to be using here. But where there's this sort of coldness that a child discovers when they are separated and they begin to identify themselves as individuals. And
Right.
as a human race, we're now actually at that point of our development. And that's why the world seems quiet now, because there's a point at which we now have to learn how to re-engage with it as mature and developed an adult, intelligences or consciousness and so on. So I think that is what is so different over this past century. I think we get this budding emergence of these creative stories like what you're talking about, where we need to intentionally re-engage with these stories. And then what happens is that an original participation starts to re-emerge again. We become aware of it again. But now we're
Yeah.
doing it intentionally, as opposed to in the past. Like you'll see in the ancient Greek stories, they won't talk about, I walked across and I did this thing. They would say stuff like, my hand betrayed me and I stabbed my brother or something, or my legs carried me over the fields. There's not this real sense of how we view ourselves today as autonomous, independent beings, where actually my body serves whatever me. is. In the ancient world, it's like my body and me are trying to figure this out, and I'm actually more of a centaur or a faun than anything else, and not everything
Right.
listens. There's a war in my members.
Yeah.
What's going through your mind with all of that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had never sort of conceived of the stages of development, being mirrored over kind of that span of time. That's really fascinating. I mean, I think really, and this is of course overly simplistic, but you can point to the Enlightenment. Really, I think is the basis in a lot of ways of that rupture with what we could call that more medieval way of thinking, where
Yeah. Hmm.
you're very much a part of the whole.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's just fascinating to consider it in those terms, and then to think about, okay, so what then does reunification, if you will,
Hmm.
um, look like? Because I think it's very easy to get trapped in the past, and
Right.
or to idealize it, right?
Hmm.
And so that strikes me as just a really interesting sort of middle ground to recognize, hey, there was something there that
Hmm.
was real and meaningful,
Hmm.
but then also to avoid that trap of therefore I must go back to the way it was, right?
Right.
We're
Right.
still moving forward, but
Hmm.
we're doing so in a way that now revisits that same place.
Right.
Um, and what does that even mean or look like, right? I mean,
Right.
in 1,000 years we'll know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And that's so to your point then about like you know uh Tolkien. We have these Oh goodness. So we have these characters, namely the hobbits, which is where the story starts. And that's not even the beginning of the story. It's like he's starting with the characters who are the most blind to how the universe and how the cosmos is constituted. They have the least level of engagement, the least level of responsibility and of awareness. And in fact, Strider and all of his rangers have been safeguarding them for generations, very guardian angel of them, until they were ready to actually engage with it. And even then, most of it never kind of broke in until the end of the War of the Ring, I think. And then at that point, they had no choice.
right.
That's the thing that fascinates me most. I think not only in my personal life, but in fiction and in stories, my theological, spiritual path. It's that sense of what is it I don't know, or like my characters, that I'm writing in stories. What is it that they don't know that they're completely unprepared for? And then I guess, who are they when everything that they don't know breaks in and introduces
Right.
itself? In many ways, I think that's just the average cycle of every human life. And it's like, who are you when the dragon knocks on your door? Or in this, Gandalf, with 7 dwarves and then trashes your larder, right?
Right.
Um, do you stay the Bilbo dragon huddled up in its, cave, or do you become the thing that goes on an adventure, that recognizes adventuring is actually the invitation for the human spirit? Maybe not in every lifetime, or maybe not in the same way for everybody, but that same sense of engaging with the deepening. Um, Anyhow, that's what fascinates me.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's I'm actually drawn to the New Testament at the moment,
Hmm.
um, because there's such a change that happens there. Again, it's the Bilbo who left is not the Bilbo who came back, and I think that anybody sees that, right? And I think that that's one of the fascinating things in the spiritual life too, because there's a few points in the book of Acts where somebody encounters one of the apostles or one of the disciples, and the scripture says something to the effect of, we can see that you are disciples of Christ.
Mm.
And this is in the narrative, it's before they've said anything,
Hmm.
it's before they've necessarily done anything,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
it sort of gives you that hint that, like, okay, there is something about these people that is so transformed as to be visible.
Yeah. Hmm.
I think it's such an interesting um, notion, right? That such a thing could happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, again, any good story, you see that, right? You look at the character at the end and you look at the character at the beginning and you recognize, it's not just the same person doing all these things. There's something fundamentally different. And a lot of stories lean on that, right? Somebody comes home and isn't recognized, or, certainly the old myths, right? I mean, they went wild with that
Yeah.
concept.
Yeah.
So the fact that's present everywhere, and then even to the degree that, I think in Lord of the Rings, right? Frodo, you get that the most,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he's just on this totally different level as everybody else, right? Like the other hobbits are laughing and joking and, hey, we're gonna go home, and like Frodo's silent, um, when he spares Saruman's life, right? Like even Saruman acknowledges, like, you have grown great indeed. And it's like, well, hold on. Like Frodo's got the most boring storyline of anybody, right? Like he doesn't win any
Yeah.
cool fights. Like he just walks a lot,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so I almost think that again, Tolkien in his genius probably did a great deal of that intentionally
Mm-hmm.
to reveal to us the nature of greatness.
Keep going. Unpack that, if you would.
Yeah, I guess so as a kid, I remember when I first read the Silmarillion, right? My favorite story is, I think, is the experience of many people, is Beren and Luthien, right?
Okay.
Obviously very, very highly esteemed by Tolkien, put it on his gravestone, all this stuff. So it makes sense in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Silmarillion, right, like the scope of things is so grand.
Mm-hmm.
And you read these characters, and then I reread The Lord of the Rings, and you have these little bits at the end when Frodo's back in Elrond's house, or maybe not even then. It might be when they make it back to Minas Tirith. But people are saying to Frodo, your story is right up there with Beren and with
Mm-hmm.
these other figures from the Silmarillion, and you're like, wait a minute, they did like crazy badass stuff. Like
Like,
Beren friggin' stormed Thangorodrim and like took a Silmaril off the crown of Morgoth. Like Frodo just walked, like, and got stung by a spider, right? And like
and then failed at the end
tried,
at the
yeah, right,
mass.
tried
Yeah.
to befriend Smeagol, and yeah, ultimately gave in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember thinking, like, what a juxtaposition. How is it that we can conceive of Frodo and what he did and truly recognize that as being as honorable and great and profound
Mm-hmm.
as these other characters who had much more, sort of traditional, if you will, heroic roles, right? They're
Right.
fighting great fights.
Yeah.
They're actually engaging directly with an enemy, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, and I think so I think there's this dash of cold water that, again, I think Tolkien does on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And then he really reveals in those last few chapters, Frodo in the Scouring of the Shire, he never picks up a sword, even,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so again, at first glance, you're like, well, who's more heroic? Is it Merry and Pippin, who are rallying the folks and who are leading the charge and wearing the bright armor?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they all defer to Frodo,
Mm-hmm.
right? When Saruman and Wormtongue come out, they defer to Frodo. And when Frodo tells Saruman to scram, he scrams. He recognizes that there's authority there. He
Mm-hmm.
hates it, but he has to give it his due. And I think that there's probably a ton going on there that's never even crossed my mind, but I think there is a sense in which if Frodo were to be the embodiment of a single heroic virtue, it would be mercy. I think Tolkien is
Interesting.
telling us of the greatness of mercy in the person of Frodo.
Yeah. I'm just thinking Gandalf, says to him, "Pity stayed his hand." I
Exactly.
wonder if pity and so he internalized as or sublimates that as mercy, as the higher version of that virtue. That's so yeah.
And you get it, I think a lot of people, because they've seen the movies and the movies are great, right? They stick in your
Mm,
head, right? And that line comes when they're in the mines of Moria.
mhm,
But in the book, it's way back in the beginning, right? It's a
mhm,
shadow of the past, like the second chapter, when
mhm.
Gandalf is explaining what's going on with this ring.
Yeah.
And so I think I do think you get it. You get it right there at the beginning. It's almost like the bookends, right? You get it right at the beginning,
Mm,
and then you get
mhm,
it at the end with Saruman, and of course in the middle, Smeagol is obviously kind of the main figure there,
mhm,
in a lot of ways. And then of course, right, Smeagol is the vehicle by which the ring is ultimately destroyed, right? So that's,
mhm,
I think, kind of the big example of
mhm,
that growth in him. But I think there's just sort of hints of it throughout in the way that Frodo responds to people that's a little bit different
mhm,
than the rest of them.
mhm.
Merry and Pippin are obviously a bit more immature.
Yeah.
Sam is just head over heels in awe most of the time, right? Or he's just in, his super practical, like, one foot in front of the other mode, right? Which is
Mhm,
tremendously important. But the way that Frodo engages with the elves and the way that he engages with, even Aragorn or Boromir, right? Like, he's very careful not to say anything negative about Boromir in front of Faramir, and not because he's trying to protect his butt, but because he has learned that mercy for Boromir. Like, he recognizes, hey, Boromir was overthrown, his will was overthrown, but like, there is still a dignity and a greatness to Boromir that deserves our honor and respect.
well, you're right. Yeah, I. It's been 15 years, I think, since I read the book, so I don't remember. But you're right. So your sense is, like you say, contrasting the exploits of Beren and Luthien um, versus Frodo. You found a way to make sense of how they can be held up with equal greatness.
Yeah, I think they're, yeah, because I think in some sense the Silmarillion, again, when you look at mythological figures, right, and
Hmm.
the Silmarillion is much more along the lines of myth in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
You're no longer dealing with individuals, right? You're dealing with paradigms. You're dealing with archetypes,
Hmm.
and so there's a sense in which it is entirely appropriate to combat Melkor face to face with a shining
Hmm.
sword,
Hmm.
and wrest the light from him. You know, I think the story that we get in the Lord of the Rings is much more human
Hmm.
in the sense that there's really nobody that it is appropriate for us to have, pure unadulterated hatred for.
Hmm.
There is nobody that we as human beings ought to, as our first recourse, just fight,
Hmm.
right? Like, you don't go up to Melkor and reason with him first, like, you fight him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boromir, you can't just go in with guns blazing, right?
Right.
Any of these characters, and it's something Tolkien really wrestled with, because with the orcs, right? Because
Hmm.
again, in the Silmarillion, in the grand mythos, right, they're obviously just the representation, or an embodiment of evil, of corruption, of death,
Hmm.
such that it is entirely appropriate to oppose them wholesale.
Hmm.
Well, in Lord of the Rings, you get a section there where Sam is overhearing, when Frodo's captured, he overhears some of the orc guards talking, and they sound like people, right? The
Yeah.
wages suck and the food's terrible, and gosh, wouldn't it be great to just run off into the hills and leave all this crap behind? And it's like they're
Hmm.
very humanized in that sense. And so that question comes up. It's like, okay, well, hold on. Are all orcs really as evil as the wanton battles would make it seem?
Hmm.
And so I think you have even there a hint that again, this story of Lord of the Rings is far more about human heroism rather
Hmm.
than mythical
Hmm.
heroism. And so what is a human hero's greatest strength or virtue? Well, it's mercy.
Hmm.
The greatest human is not the one who can kill the most people,
Hmm.
right? Not the one who can slay the most evil, because the reality is that everyone and everything in our world is good and evil mixed.
Hmm.
So I think that's also kind of part of that parallel, and part of why why it looks so different, and especially like you think about, like you said, the world wars that these authors had been through.
Mm-hmm.
How easy would it be to continue to demonize
Mm-hmm.
the Germans, right, for their whole lives? And many people obviously did and still do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to be able to recognize there's a call for mercy there, right? Maybe they've done horrible things, but there's a call for mercy there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, I don't know which book it was. I think it was one of Stephen Ambrose's books. It tells a story of Christmas Eve, right? You have the Americans on one side and the Germans on the other side, and somebody starts singing Christmas carols,
Yeah.
and they come together in the middle of the battlefield, I don't know, exchange cigarettes and medical supplies and whatever, but the war's off, for at
Yeah.
least a day.
Christmas truce. Yeah.
Um, it's almost that same sense. Frodo is there with enough to say, listen, the war's off.
Mm-hmm.
you know Maybe there's still some consequences, there's still some things that need to get
Yeah.
cleaned up.
I mean, he was prepared to let Saruman go at the end, despite of everything he'd done. You just wanted to
Yeah.
banish him, right? So what's interesting about what you're saying there is trying to understand where Tolkien's coming with this, because he's intuiting massive swaths of this story, and he's writing all these notes, and Beren and Luthien is in his mind, and I think he's got the children of Hurin in his mind as well when he goes to create the character of Aragorn. But all of that, it's like a line pointing to the role in the character of Frodo. Because Aragorn is like the human who has learned the graces or the virtues of Frodo, but he has not only the great darkness of Hurin in him, which is profoundly human, but human who completely fell and failed. And that is in line with as you said, the great mythical stories that precede them both. That I'd never considered that with the Silmarillion. I've only read it once. As incredible as it is, I've only read the whole thing through once. And of course, I remember being floored by it, and it's stunning. I never considered that there's, as much as it is probably meant to be a whole lot of history, it's also meant to be a lot of mythical stuff. And in the same way that we would look at a lot of the super ancient stories of scripture, or let's say some of the scriptures of the what is it called, the Rig Veda, or the Hindus or ancient Buddhist stories, they're massive and they're mythical, but they're actually meant to be understood in a meta level of human experience, right, not a historical level of human experience. And to think of the Silmarillion as starting to accomplish those same sorts of things, like your quick outline there of Beren and Luthien's story, it's like, oh, wait a second, that actually sounds incredibly like a symbolic or sort of redemptive reimagining of the Adam and Eve story, and what it would take for Adam and Eve to rediscover their glory after having lost everything and created everything that. But of course, it's a story. It's meant to stand on its own, but then we're meant to read stuff into it. And I'm sure purists are probably ready to savage me, but okay.
I mean, there probably are, but at the same time, there's no escaping that, right? Like,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's some extremes that you can probably definitively say, are wrong, but if you couldn't encounter it as who you are and bring your own life to it, then it wouldn't be captivating.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Why does this story? Why did so for today's conversation? You said this was coming up. Was there something that kicked that off, or something you saw or sparked why this line of thinking mattered to you?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I think these are just, in some sense, these are just the sorts of things that I think about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I first read, just story in general is very, very important in my life. I first read The Lord of the Rings in second grade, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, comprehended probably the tiniest sliver, but the ideas, again, the worldview. I mean, I still read. I would guess honestly, I probably read The Lord of the Rings about once a year. And I've probably got 5 or 6 books that are like annual books. Little Prince is another one, right? Very different genre, but still resonates. And I think that so much of, let me think about what I want to say before I say it so that I say it well. I mean, this could probably be its own conversation, but I think so. When I grew up, I was very um, analytical. I mean, I still am, but in a less mature way, right? As a child, I mean, very analytical, systems, rules, the reasons why, like all of that, I could wrap my head around. But when it came to the way that I understood that I ought to be living, I could never live up to it. Right? It was idealized. It was way too much. And so my experience of myself as an individual in a lot of ways was a letdown.
Mm.
And so I think one of the things that saved me were the stories that I had and the stories that I read and the understanding that whatever I amount to, as great or as small as that may be,
Mm-hmm.
I am part of something that is so much bigger and greater than these individual circumstances, than my individual faults and failings. I am carried on this current to places that I just can't get myself.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously the principal story there being the Christian story, right? The gospel. But even again, Lord of the Rings and just any of the other books that I read, like I loved Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles and
Oh, you're the
T.A. Barron's.
third person I've ever met who knows that series.
Oh my gosh, I've probably read each of those,
So
probably a
many
dozen times
times.
too.
Yep.
But Taran's a great example from that series, right? Like he's kind of a screw up,
Uh-huh.
right? But he becomes part of this greater story, and you see how even this hick kid from the country, with these dreams of what glory ought to be,
Yeah.
like the dreams
Mm-hmm.
keep getting dashed,
Mm-hmm.
but dashed because they were false, right? They were mirages. And
Mm-hmm.
he starts seeing the real heroism, right? Like when he first meets Gwydion and he's like, you can't possibly be him. He's this great prince and whatever, whatever. And he's like, yeah, great princes sometimes wear, crummy clothes and,
Mm-hmm.
just do what needs doing, and so that's, probably the first instance where you really see that theme of shattering the illusion of greatness and replacing it with a truer understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I think story helped me shatter my illusions of perfection and understand something greater and something true about myself that I just couldn't see
Mm-hmm.
because I had these shadows,
Mm-hmm.
prancing about. So I think about this kind of thing all the time. I guess is the short answer to your question. I don't think
Yeah.
this had a specific catalyst, so much as this is just a well that I come back to and drink from somewhat frequently.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to pull on that thread for a minute because there's something there that I'm trying to put my finger on, which is you return to story and mythology and stories in general, but ultimately, okay, you said something there which was interesting, and I want to sort of press on it because it's routinely served up as a thought, which is um, story is what grounds us, and of course we know ultimately what that story is. It's the gospel, and then everybody sort of nods piously, and then, well, at that point the conversation's basically over because we're all pretty sure we know what everybody's talking about, and then we sort of go back to our lives. And
Yeah.
I am trying, I don't know how to do this yet. I've been slowly sort of walking around that particular idea as my frustration with it when we, not against you, but like in general, when it's usually
Yeah.
served up, because it's a way to shut down imagination, to shut down creativity. It's like that one line, whenever you start talking about heaven, right? This became a big deal for me last 10 years. We start talking about heaven, and then routinely that quote is served up, which is, well, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, So whatever you can imagine is not going to, meet up to that. So shut up already. Whereas now I'm like, no, 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 wait a second. That line is a challenge to you to imagine boldly,
Yeah.
because no matter how far you go and as great as you can conceive and what Silmarillions you might build up in your mind, heaven will still forever always exceed that. And so that insatiable sense of the human spirit, there's a reason why scripture says for ages upon ages of time, and where we will spend plumbing the depths and the glory of God and the fascination, the interest, all of the levels of the hierarchies of angels, and how they're never able to be satisfied because God is infinite. And I know I am never going to be satisfied. In fact, the greatest, it's like Alexander reaching the edge of the world and looking up at the stars and crying, going, there's nowhere else to go. It's just, this is the greatest depression. It's like, there's nothing else to sort of conquer, where else do I go from here? To have that restored to the human spirit, that, okay, there's the gospel. I'm not sure anybody actually knows what that means, because that is a mustard seed of an idea. And that has to be clothed in a heck of a lot of dirt for it to be able to start the process of dying and germination and growth. And then depending on where you grow it in the world, it shows up looking a little different. I don't know, it might taste a little different, but it's still ultimately the same sort of thing. And that's where I think, so coming back to this idea of story and mythology, in the same sense that God is present in every human, every person, and yet every single person is so completely, I'd like to say delightfully different, but there are some people who tick me off, but we'll allow that from the God view of things. Every human being is delightfully unique from God's point of view. That then means not that, well, God is, in every human heart and stuff. Doesn't mean that humans are less valuable or less interesting, but they're more, because he loves them with an infinite love. He calls them into greater focus and adventuring, and therefore we'll spend, it's one thing about eternity is you'll spend forever trying to meet everybody, and then I'm not actually sure that we'll have infinite memory capacity, so I might have to keep relearning all the people, but that's another question.
Right.
Well, then that comes back to storytelling, accomplishing the same sort of thing. You need an infinite number of stories to try to clothe and communicate what we're trying to talk about with what God is.
Yeah, and it's interesting. These aren't your words, so I guess I'm kind of summarizing, but then perhaps layering some of my experience on it. But that idea that, like, once you present the gospel, everything falls flat, and it's like, how is this most interesting of stories falling flat? Like, if any story is not going to fall flat, it should be this one.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reality of it is, in any good story, right? Where's the treasure? Somewhere else, right? It's buried, it's hidden, it's guarded, it's in a dragon's hoard. The treasure is somewhere else. And so when you come up and you tell somebody, well, the gospel, right? It's like you're taking a chest of treasure and you're just dumping it at their feet. And the thing about all of these hoards of treasure in all of these stories, it is always so much more than anybody could ever possibly need. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating. And so I think the problem is like you said, that desire for the infinite. Well, I don't just want to find my mortgage buried in the ground, right? If I go on this great treasure hunt and I face the dragon, I don't want to dig up next month's rent payment. Like, sure, that'd be nice, but like, that would be a letdown of a story, right? It's got to be some fabulous otherworldly prize. And so with the gospel, I think we throw out all of these riches, and it's like, yes, there is so much given freely before you even take a step. But the fact that you have something to start with does not, you have not exhausted the treasure that's out there, the treasure that has to be dug for and hunted, and you got to slay the dragon to get. So I think we almost fool ourselves, right? We get a nugget and we think, wow, this is better than anything I deserve. Cool, I'm going to put it in my pocket and hang on to it in the end. And it's like, the whole point of that was your first clue that somewhere out there, right, is this fabulous treasure that is beyond your imagining, and yeah, so the stories then kind of rekindle that a little bit. It's like, hey, whatever
Mhm.
treasure you have, right? I mean, we live in America, right? We're the most ridiculously wealthy any human beings as a group have ever been in the history of the world. We live in comfort that couldn't have been imagined even 100 years ago.
Yeah.
We need the stories to rekindle the fact that there's something even better than this.
Right. Agreed. And then here's I mean, not only do we like see through a glass darkly and all, but the thing about truth, and let's say the truth of the gospel, is you need a whole lot of stories to try to capture it, because it's the thing is, you need stories to dilute the truth, because it's so it's so powerful and it's so simple, it's incomprehensible. Like you walk up to somebody on the street and you straight up tell them whatever piece of truth might be, they don't have the ears to hear. They're either their life isn't in the right place, or they're not filled with or wrapped with the right level of stories to make sense of what it is that you're telling them. Half the time think that's why a lot of things happen the way they do in scriptures, because God just needs people to be seasoned by enough time in mythology and storytelling of their own making, so that when he is able to grant a vision or a message, we've been messing around with enough fan fiction to be able to start. We have enough like mental sigils and symbols that we can then use to start clothing these messages to dilute the power of that message into something that we can actually understand, which then means it's like truth is like, it's like this massive billion faceted diamond. And I mean, truth is a person, truth is Christ. So we're talking about the emergence or the impulse, the presence of Christ. And it's like a billion infinite faceted diamond. And at any given time, all we can ever see is one facet sort of pressing into our mind, our reality. But there's a billion more of those, and each one of those requires its own story. I'm reading a book right now called, it seems like a completely fun and random topic, but it's the Tibetan yogas of, no, I forgot what it is. Tibetan practices for dream yoga, something like that. I just wanted to learn something I'd never heard of before. And I'm reading through this, I'm trying to understand what Tibetan Bon Buddhism is from their viewpoint.
Yeah.
And first of all, it's beautiful and it's brilliant and it's smart, and it makes, they don't need me telling them that, but there's an incredible something that's there. And then what I begin to realize is we do so much. We have a particular story in the First World West. You mentioned the Enlightenment, 400 years of a specific kind of mental story model and view on what mythology and meta anything means. And then we read that into our reading of the scriptures. And then a lot of our catechesis expresses that. And so I think now we're kind of trying this sense of, well, let's get back into the minds of an ancient Hebrew. What is it like to see the world through their viewpoint? Because that's what Christ would have been using. Those are the symbols and the symbolic language that he would have been using to communicate with people of his time. Well, what also then happens if you enter into, let's say, the Tibetan Bon Buddhism story and worldview and cosmos, which maps onto an insane level of accuracy of how our world is constituted. And then you go and you read the Gospels. You get completely different insights, or new, not different, as in the sense of like we're, reimagining the doctrines. It's not that. You get new insights in what they're communicated and how they relate to the world and how we also relate to the world. And the insights are, they're not just compelling because they're new. They unlock more because it's a different story. And it creates a different relationship between us and each other and the cosmos. Anyhow, so that sense of like, you need more and more stories. And we need to be filled with them. So as we start to wrap here, I don't know if you've ever heard, there is a ancient, well, he's not ancient. He's alive today, Martin Shaw. And he's somebody who's reviving or bringing back the ancient storytelling tradition. And he makes this point that our souls don't communicate in words. Our souls communicate in stories, in like dream moments. A story is like this all at once experience of a character desiring something in the process of doing something to achieve that goal, right? And in a dream, like we intuit this all at once when we enter into a dream moment. And he makes the point that that's how our souls communicate. Our minds and our waking consciousness communicates in sequential series of ideas and words and language which is a sort of disembodied, distance, objectified form of communication, but the soul doesn't. The soul communicates in strings of stories. And so when I look at modern culture and how ravenous we are to be fed stories, I mean, there's now an entire industry that's kind of gone insane. But the reason it's so successful is because all of us are starving because the stories aren't feeding us properly. And then you get someone like, I think, Peter Jackson taking Lord of the Rings or taking Narnia or, Harry Potter or Star Trek or Star Wars. And there is an incredible depth to these stories. And even when they're, you can argue this point, done badly or not done perfectly, they still boil the world and transform a generation just because the meaning and that depth is something we're so hungry for. And that's why I think fandoms are such a powerful way of relating to each other. Before you get to the point of the gospel, you start with a fandom. And let me stop there. What would your response be to some of that?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by yeah, and I could talk all night too. So probably my kids are going to get hungry and want food at some point. But the idea that we don't communicate in word, or that the fundamental, I forget what you said, but the fundamental way that the soul communicates is not words, it's stories. And then bringing dreams into it, right? Where everything seems to happen on top of each other sometimes, right? But it's all coherent at the same time. I mean, it just gave me this sense of, so much of our lives is, like you said, it's strung out sort of horizontally, right? There's this moment and then this moment and then this moment, or there's this word I said and then this one and this one.
Mm-hmm.
But we have this capacity within us because we're spiritual beings
Mm-hmm.
for these vertical moments where we experience things that are stacked on top of each other. They're
Mm-hmm.
not strung out sequentially. They're not bound by space and time,
Mm-hmm.
right? We are connecting with the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not coherent in the way that I can plan out my day or recount, a bike ride. It's the glory and the absurdity of, like, I saw this flower, and in that flower I saw the entire universe, my entire life. Like, I just sat there and stared at this flower for 10 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And from the sequential standpoint, we're thinking like 10 minutes, one flower. Weren't you bored? Whatever, right? Like all these sequential thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But we do have this capacity that we get drawn into where, like I said, we're no longer existing horizontally, we're existing spiritually, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think stories are that bridge. How do we get from the horizontal to the spiritual? Stories wrap it all together. They appeal to the whole human person.